Yeah, like,
Yo, question. So it sounds like a lot of y'all are like digital artists or stuff like that, or you're transposing your stuff into digital for your prints and using printing services. Is there anyone else in the room who's doing a lot of just like hand printing and dealing with sending that out rather than reproduction?
I also messed up screen. Well, I mean, if you're printing a digital thing, theoretically everything's a reproduction because the original is just it's a master file. It's a virtual thing. So you're just bringing
Well, right.
it
What
to the world.
what I'm
Right?
talking about though, yeah, I'm not. So like example of my work. If I make a tri-point print, I'm engraving the plate myself by hand. I'm inking the plate. I'm wiping the plate, and I'm running the plate through my printing press. The output is a print rather than something that's been digitized in any way. And I'm just curious, like what the ratio is of like, because like for me, if I sell, like I will sell a digitized print because I can sell that to somebody who might not be able to pay the amount of money for the hand printed version, and so it gives it greater access to people and stuff like that. But I'm just curious about like how many people in the room, whether printmakers or painters or like Justin photographers, maybe doing wet prints or any of that kind of stuff. If people are actually are still working to any degree with stuff outside of the digital, more like the I don't know what you would call it, the I don't know,
Analog.
Yeah, like the analog organic version of what it is, the non-digitized, the analog. I'm not printing like that, but I'm very hands on with the printing process. So I go into the actual printer place, and I'm sitting down at the computer with them, and I'm going through and I'm talking with them like, yo, I need this color to be this saturated, and I need this a little bit, I need that a little more toned down. Like I'm hands on with it, but it is a digital format, and it's just done on a very high quality paper. I used to actually run a printing business in New York where I worked with a bunch of artists all the time, printing their paintings or their murals, and also I actually worked in the darkroom, color darkroom, Silk Screen Lab. So I'm actually a master printer in a way, and you just really need a high res file if you're doing digital. We would always shoot with a Hasselblad medium format digital camera to make sure it's absolutely resolute. And then in the darkroom, it's just the grain of the chemicals or the acrylic paint, whatever process you're doing. Yeah, that's where I'm asking from. Like a part of my background, I was a platinum palladium printer when I was in New York for a number of people, and that was one of the big things where there were always very different standards in terms of the handling and the processing and everything like that. Where if you have an image and you're going to run it through a digital printer, then yeah, it's like what Kenneth was, or no, who was just saying that. I think Thomas was saying being super hands-on with the printer and being able to dial in all of the visual aspects that they want. But if you're going to work with something like a platinum palladium print, you're mandatory on cotton racking, working with heavy metals in solution, UV printed, all that kind of stuff. It's going to have some level of light sensitivities, and you got toning and all that kind of stuff as well. You end up in a different situation with how the degree of control that you have, and then how it has to be handled and everything like that. So that's what I'm curious about is like how if there are people in the room who are working on both sides of the analog and the digital aspects, and how they're currently finding what that experience is like now. Most of my stuff ends up being analog, so I don't really have a lot of experience on the digital side of it. So that's why I'm interested in the stuff that y'all are talking about and saying is interesting to me because I don't experience a lot of it. Hi, Pluto. My name's Bobby. Just had a question for you. What camera did you say?
Wait, can we not interrupt?
Sorry.
it's really important to work analog in an analog style, and I appreciate all the like details, and I wish I had access to a print shop right now, but I don't, which is why I'm mostly doing like paintings and like more like monoprint type stuff. But yeah, I just wanted to say I agree. What was your question?
I just asked if you're in New York because I can connect you with people and print shops and stuff.
Yeah, if you were in San Diego, you could use my press.
I know somebody in LA.
Who
do you have for San Diego?
Or you be here. Wait, who just said San Diego?
Sorry, it was Coco. I was just asking who you have for San Diego.
So I don't know if anybody is talking. Coco, where are you?
Maybe she got bumped out or something? She's further down. She's right above. No, they're right there. If anybody's in Los Angeles, I know a really awesome like community print shop for silk screening. Super rad people.
Is it the print shop LA?
No, it's called Grow Your Own Media.
ATMU for that?
Yeah, definitely.
Starting to look for a place to rent out for a couple months to make some prints.
Yeah, this guy, like I know him for a long time. He's super awesome. I actually started printing in a space, like we lived together, and his bedroom was his like silk screen space. So I got to use that. And he built out this really awesome space in Los Angeles.
Does he have a printer so you can print out transparency and like do photographs and then convert it?
He's got like such an awesome setup. Tons of people print there, like probably campaigns that you would know, like straight up campaigns and stuff. But like just really good people. He's got, my understanding is that it's like, you know, from start to finish you can do your entire thing, especially if you know what to do. Like they're there to help, but and they also hold classes, although I don't know what's going on currently with like COVID. But yeah, hit me up. No, I'll give you their info. I'll definitely DM you. Yeah, totally. Anybody's welcome to.
Any artists that are listening in the audience, if you have not invested in a good printer, please do so before you start shipping out any products. If you want return customers or repeat customers, pay attention to your printing and print the best quality work so that you can have repeat customers, because all it takes is one bad person to say something like, yo, this print isn't quality, and be upset about it, and it could really mess up your whole career as an artist.
I have a question.
A pain in the ass, but and some money, but to shop around and test print, like you know, man, you really know, you can really tell like which printers are really, you know, tops in town, etc. That's why I think doing it local is better, but everybody doesn't always have those kind of printers, like fine art printers. But there's something about locally, and then you can see it and hold it in your hand, and you know, talk to them. That maybe once you get all that down and you really know, okay, this is the type of paper that I need, and you know, these are the specs. Then you can kind of go online, and you're going to maybe closer to knowing what to expect, because you're going to have really fine-tuned what you actually want to print.
Yeah, I go through a printer in DC for camera, like but I go through this one woman, and I will not go through anybody else. And I sign all of my prints, but it's like I had to shop around to try to find a good print shop that I felt like produced really good quality, and they actually give me it's like these like big wide tubes for free. depending on how many prints I order at a certain time. So I would love to find one more local to me that's maybe not in Arlington, Virginia, because I know I live in Maryland. I don't know if there's anybody like in DC listening or DC Maryland area, but I haven't found anyone better than District Camera.
Are you talking about darkroom prints or digital prints?
I'm talking about digital prints.
So I have a question. I know we just had a conversation about like local printers and going to them, and then Kenneth brought up that you should invest in a printer. So I'm wondering, I'm starting off thinking about making prints, and I don't really know where to start. Or should I look locally? What's the difference between investing in a printer or going to like a print place?
I'm sorry. I didn't mean invest in like a tangible, like you do it yourself printer. I mean,
oh, okay, sorry.
Investing in a print company. If you have the time to if you have the time to do that, yeah, you look into it. But me personally, I don't have the time, so I need a good quality printing company, and I want to build a relationship with that printing company so that they, whenever I'm getting printed, and keyword is relationship. So the more you go to this printer, like they know what to expect when they're printing your work. So 9 times out of 10, if your relationship is established with them and they know the kind of quality you're looking for, they know the consistency that you want to put out there, you could actually just drop off and go and come back, and then they'll have your stuff like on point. But again, that's about building relationships. Somebody mentioned finding a local printer, and the reason you find a local printer again is so that you can build that relationship and they know you. So whenever I go into my printing company, like it's first name basis. We sit, we talk, we make jokes. It's even gotten to the point. It's even gotten to the point to where like they would normally charge, I want to say like $12 a square foot, where they charge me because I've been there so long, they charge me maybe $1.50 a square foot because of the relationship, because I've been there so long. And so they're just like, hey, we got you. I mean, there's even been times where I've come in and I've ordered prints, and then I'm like, yo, should I pay for it now? And they're like, no, don't worry about it. And then I come in the next day and I'm like, yo, I still got to pay for that. And they're like, don't worry about it. And then I come in a week later and they're like, I still got it. They're like, what? Pay for what? So it's again, it's about building a relationship, them knowing what you want, and being consistent with your product. And the more you come in, the better they treat you, and you can kind of pass that on back to them. So,
and not only that, like I started to reach a point where I got really picky, where like I had very specific canvas I wanted to use, so I like bought the roll of canvas, and it's quite an investment. But it's like now finding the printer that knows you well enough that you cannot like store it there while your orders are being done and stuff like that, or working that out, or even being able to bring your own paper in or something. It's going to be people that kind of know you better and know that you're going to keep coming back, or else it's not worth them calibrating their machines and stuff like that.
And honestly, there is the other side of this, or I guess what the misunderstanding was, and I'm speaking, I guess, for Kelly. I think that was you who asked the question. If you have the time, and I mean like a significant amount of time, it's not a horrible idea to get a very high quality printer and to learn that skill set. It takes a lot of time, and there's a learning curve, but doing that would also let you make potentially smaller pieces that you don't have to go to a printer for, and it lets you develop the type of vocabulary that Micah was talking about, where like you can go in there and you can have a conversation about calibration, you can have a conversation about density, you can have a conversation about all of those things out of experience. So they're both worthwhile. It's just how much time you have.
Thank you so much, guys. That was super helpful. I'm thinking for where I'm at, very, very new. So I think, outsourcing it, building that relationship is just going to teach me a little bit. I don't really want to dive in and learn a whole new skill set, but I do see the benefit of that, like once I get familiar with printing terms or, sizes, different paper, that kind of stuff. So thank you.
the keyword
also
again.
Sorry. I was just going to say that most printers, they'll have sample books of different types of paper that you can either they'll send them to you or sometimes they cost a few bucks, but those are well worth the investment, so you know what type of paper is what when you're looking at the names of them.
Yeah, and that's the thing too. It's like if we're bringing, Kenneth mentioned this as well, and Micah Ray mentioned it as well too. Like if you're going to go to a printer and you're going to use the paper stock that they have, whatever of the variety of paper stocks that they have, then they're going to be set in the sense that their machines and everything are going to be calibrated to those papers. But if you have a particular paper that you want to use, you go out and you find some type of cotton rag or a muslin or something like that that you want to use that you really love the texture of. If you're going to bring that to a printer, if you just walk in and you say, hey, I want to print on this, and they don't really get into a conversation about calibration with you, walk out the door and find someone else. That's just not going to be a good quality. Whatever material it is that you're printing on the machinery and the technology and the computer files and everything like that needs to be fully calibrated for the material being printed on with transfer curve and all that kind of stuff, so that the image itself is represented accurately, the colors are represented accurately, the luminosity is represented accurately. So a good printer is going to have a conversation with you about all of that if you're bringing in, a material of your own and not just using something that they have.
There's not you don't have to limit yourself to just printing on paper. These days there's tons of different substrates that these printers can print on. You can make and a huge range of things that are really cool to look at. I don't know if we're allowed to plug companies that we use here. Not like
plug them.
Do it. So the company that I use is Bay Photos. I think they're up in the Bay Area. But I've had some I haven't ordered a ton of stuff from them, but I definitely like the quality of their stuff. And their metal prints are cool, although I will not purchase them with the square corners because that freaks me out. Yeah, and I just had a question about printing, and I'm pretty sure I know the answer to this, and I'm going to be sad, but maybe you guys know something I don't. I work with fluorescent colors sometimes, and there's just no way to print those, right?
You can. There's a material. I have to ask my buddy what it's called. He's done that before. And if you can find him on here, he's on here. I gave him an invite. His name is Sean Deckert.
Awesome.
Hey, Pluto, what's up, man?
Are you in here?
Yeah, I jumped on here earlier and they just opened it up.
Yo, that's my boy. This dude was the best man at my wedding.
Nice.
Reunion.
Yo, so wait, I'm trying to find you in the thing, but yeah. So Sean, that do you remember what that was called? It was like some weird translucent hard material, but they were able to print where it had like a fluorescent. It was able to capture like fluorescent colors. Do you remember that?
I mean, just the hologram stuff. I'm not really sure what you're talking about, to be honest. I just missed that, but the hologram stuff is a little tricky. You could probably create your own inkjet printer, but that would be really complicated to create your own ink containers with the fluorescent ink.
Yeah, I mean, I can always just hand embellish them after, which
place where anything can happen. The stratosphere, beyond the red zone.
Patrick Mahomes is defying the laws.
Welcome to another Dumb Things People Say to Atheists. In our last episode, we looked at a common accusation about atheists as a group. And while the video got off to a pretty strong start, views came to an abrupt halt a couple days in, possibly because the video kept talking about a certain 20th century political figure. Whoops, whoopsie. But today we're going to move on to a less algorithm sabotaging topic, which is a common thing Christians ask atheists when, as we are known for doing, we find apologetic arguments unconvincing. It seems to be expressed with an undertone of exasperation, and if you've been following the online conversation, it's a little topical right now. And that is, what would it take to make you believe in God? Well, I guess him existing would be a vital start, but let's flesh out the details after the music. Now this is a really strange question, perhaps the main reason being that it assumes you would want to, and maybe should be expected to, dive straight into somebody else's supernatural belief system to assess what it claims, how much evidence there is for it, and why you don't find the evidence sufficient. Then use all this information to help you speculate on what hypothetical thing would convince you. This is a lot of energy to put into something you don't believe. But I can kind of understand why some Christians might ask this. And remember, I'm saying not only some, but might, because we're only trying to get possible insights into why sincere, intelligent Christians might say these things, not trying to pin any specific motivation on all or even a subset of them. To understand this question, we need to understand how pivotal Christianity is to the thinking of believers. Many are so totally immersed in it that it becomes the lens through which they see everything. To them, people across the world are either Christian or non-Christian. All actions are either sins or not sins. And the question of whether someone chooses to accept Christ or not is of the utmost importance, especially if that person is a close loved one. On top of this all, the claims of Christianity are well-established facts, which may sound weird to us from the outside, but remember that many Christians live in tight-knit communities that model confident acceptance of these facts. They're factually aware that there are a lot of non-believers out in the world, but this population might be a distant, faceless, easily misrepresented group of others. What this all means is there's a big difference between how believers see the religion and how outsiders see it, creating a communication barrier that can set them up for a lot of frustration. And I can see the question, what would it take to make you believe, arising from this frustration. For one, think of how the outside world is represented within Christianity. Perhaps above all else, it's a plentiful harvest field full of lost souls waiting to hear the good news. And this is key, because when you train people to see outsiders as inevitably eager recipients of a salvation anybody should want, you set them up to misunderstand basic and understandable reactions to being hounded about their religion. It will be easy to think any non-receptive person just, 1, rejects Jesus because they're wicked, or 2, aren't yet ready for a variety of possible reasons, and just need you to keep coming back to speak the love of Jesus to them as the Spirit works in their heart, which, trust me, is far different from how most non-believers who just finished saying, no thank you, think things should proceed. This can lead Christians to become more and more frustrated the longer they see someone rebuffing their efforts as Jesus' wingman, especially if it's a close loved one they want to see as the not yet ready type instead of the lost cause type. And after every plea, every expression of Christ's love or warning of the dangers of hell, and every apologetic fails, I could see their frustration building to the point that they throw up their hands and blurt out, well, what would convince you? Remember, after all, that what they're showing you has been reinforced as established and easily understood fact within their community. And the narrative of evangelism ends with sincere people accepting Jesus because who wouldn't? So it's natural for them to be not only distressed by your lack of response, but sincerely puzzled that you're not convinced. This bafflement is further exacerbated by another narrative I've discussed before, which is that of atheists being quickly and easily convinced by basic arguments. Not only are believers taught that apologetics represent an open and shut case for Christianity, but they hear professionals tell possibly questionable stories about how they used to be atheists until they heard a square one apologetic and, possibly after spending some time being stubborn because of sin and stuff, were like, wow, 500 eyewitnesses saw Jesus? Where do I sign up? So if you don't meet the expectations set by this narrative by immediately folding in the face of these amazing arguments, you come off as just being pig-headed. And I could see a believer finally being like, look man, I've already explained the cosmological argument and the moral argument and the teleological argument and told you about the manuscripts. If that's not enough for you, what would convince you? In short, I would see this question usually coming from a combination of two factors. One, they see the religion as so pivotal that it should take up more of outsiders' headspace than it realistically will. And two, their religion has set them up to misunderstand and become frustrated by people's lack of response to it. But as always turns out being the case in these dumb things videos, while I can understand where this question comes from, it really isn't a constructive one. The most fundamental reason, as I've explained, is that it assumes too much interest and engagement by people outside the religion. If you find people aren't being convinced, then work harder at convincing them or come to peace with their lack of belief. I mean, if they want to devote their time to understanding something they don't believe in so well that they can explain what would make them believe it, I guess that's fine. But you can't demand it of them, and you have to understand why most people wouldn't want to. Another issue is that it assumes the current arguments, or possibly anecdotal evidence for God, are way more compelling than they are, or at least than most people see them. In some cases, this question can come off as a rhetorical one that's more asking, how could the evidence you've already seen not be enough for you out of incredulity, than seriously wondering what further steps are needed. But while that's all well and good, I know what you might be thinking. Prophet Azad, why don't you stop bitching about this question and actually answer it? And while you didn't have to think it in that tone, yes, discussing possible answers to this question is worthwhile, because ultimately that will help us flesh out the biggest underlying issue with this problem. So let's look at a few hypotheticals. First is one of the most common obvious answers, which is a clearly supernatural event. Now a miracle sounds pretty open and shut, right? But there are some pretty serious issues with this answer. And to illustrate, let's look at what Braxton Hunter says about atheists who won't accept apparent miracles as proof of God.
If an asteroid strikes the moon and suddenly it is written in Hebrew and Greek, God exists, it's not good enough. It could be aliens using advanced technology. But obviously, this is a level of skepticism that the average citizen does not have. If you ask the average citizen who happens to be an atheist if they would believe if they saw an ocean parted in Jesus' name, they would say, yes, of course I would. If you ask the average citizen whether riding on the moon or a personal encounter with God would be enough for them to believe, they're going to say yes. If you ask them whether logical arguments in principle might convince them, many, if not most of them, are going to be open to that. Let's call this atheist, Atheist A. So what does this mean? This means there is a huge difference between what Atheist A, the average citizen who happens to be an atheist, considers to be good and bad evidence, and what Atheist B considers to be good and bad evidence. Seeing someone's head get cut off, and then reattached an hour later, involving that person telling someone about an experience of an afterlife they had, and information from a conversation that that person alone would know about this deceased friend or loved one, might not be evidence for God, or isn't evidence for God, because it could be aliens using advanced technology, or someone else using an advanced technology. Atheist B has an epistemology that people like Matt Dillahunty have chiseled out over years that prevents them from accepting as good evidence what Atheist A would consider fantastic evidence.
Now yes, I suppose some atheists are more potentially gullible than others, if that's the point Braxton's trying to make. And if I can be described as Atheist B, it's not because I specifically refuse to accept evidence for God. Rather, it's because I'm cautious about what I let myself assume about any strange phenomena I observe. If I see a bright light in the sky that moves in an unexpected way, I might say, wow, that was a weird bright light, and possibly look into it more. What I wouldn't say is, Wow, that was a weird bright light, so now I know aliens are flying around in saucer-shaped ships. When you say the first thing, you're acknowledging what you saw evidence for and keeping your conclusions limited to a description of that evidence. When you say the second, you're, consciously or not, letting separate assertions or general cultural baggage start filling in gaps, thus assuming way more than you actually saw. When you do this, you at best have an undisciplined epistemology that can lead you to random conclusions every time you see something weird. And at worst, you're waiting for the chance to smuggle specific assumptions into any weird thing you see in hopes that it will lead you to a specific conclusion. In either case, whether your epistemology is either this sloppy or ready to home in on a desired answer, I think it's safe to say there's a problem with it. But Braxton plays a little trick of language here by misconstruing our caution about prematurely jumping to unwarranted conclusions in general as a specific unwillingness to ever reach his conclusion. To be fair, this might not be deliberate, and he might just be dealing with the kind of frustration I described earlier. Christians who want to convince others of their God's existence are faced with a daunting obstacle, namely the apparent long-standing absence of God or even of supernatural phenomena that can be attributed to him, which leaves them dying to pounce on any real or even hypothetical supernatural event that they can attribute to him. When you're that hungry to finally have your evidence, and of course you've been trained to see anything supernatural in terms of Christian theology, you're going to be primed to automatically interpret anything that seems supernatural as evidence for God. So you can imagine that when others aren't quite as quick to see it the same way, they will come off as stubborn, to the point the Christian might see them as simply unwilling to accept evidence at all. But one thing Christians fail to see is they're not the only ones hungry for evidence. There are any number of believers in ghosts, UFOs, other religions, conspiracy theories, or whatever else, who feel just as eager to pounce on an unexplained phenomenon, connect the dots according to their assumptions, and claim it as their own. Sure, a Christian can scoff at the idea of people suggesting maybe it was powerful aliens if something were written on the moon or a person's head came off and back on. But why? Is there evidence for it being God rather than powerful aliens? No. And a believer in aliens might just as easily scoff if they showed you the same things and you suggested God is an alternative possibility. This is because neither God nor aliens is an inevitable explanation for what you actually saw, but either is a possible explanation. So people just tack on whichever one they're already invested in and then laugh at the other possibilities since, everybody's good at noticing how silly other people's paranormal claims are. And by the way, slipping in details about invoking Jesus' name or telling about an afterlife doesn't get much traction here. We're still in mysterious territory with a lot of possible explanations, and people can be deceived or mistaken. A fact even the Bible prepares Christians for by warning them about things like false teachers of the devil appearing as an angel of light. So if they expect us to take stock in any pro-Christian utterance associated with a weird phenomena, while themselves feeling free to take any anti-Christian utterance as a demonic deception, it seems pretty clear to me that this is about finding any possible path to existing religious belief, not about expanding your epistemological horizons. But okay, let's move beyond simple miracles and be even more direct. What if we actually saw God himself appear as a being of light and announce himself? That should do it, right? But even this kind of appearance is tricky because it runs contrary to the patterns of reality as we've observed it so far, and would leave us with plenty of reason to wonder what had actually happened. Was it a hallucination? Should you believe that whatever it was truthfully representing itself as God? How does the definition of God equation? How confident could you be that you're clearly remembering the details over time, and what would you make of them? Over the course of months and years, after this one-time light show had faded under the relentless grind of consistent physical reality, you would have more and more reason to wonder, right? Now some Christians might see these questions as attempts at explaining away what was right in front of you. But if this scenario were reversed such that the being of light announced Hinduism or Islam as the true religion, I imagine they do a marvelous job laying out the limits of what this appearance could tell us. But let's go even a step further and look at a great workaround Pelagius suggested for this problem, which is that the being might provide information, such as a bit of scientific knowledge of the solution to a complex math problem, that you as an observer wouldn't have known otherwise. All that stuff Jesus never explained when he was on Earth. This makes hallucination a less likely answer, and brings us closer to finding a one-time appearance convincing, possibly as close as we could get. But even if you walked away knowing something totally new, you might still wonder what had happened, how you got the knowledge, and who had given it to you. And the further we dive into these thought experiments, the more hoops we make this hypothetical God jump through to prove his existence, the more we see the desperation behind trying to prove an otherwise non-manifesting entity through a one-time event. To understand why, let's think about why we believe most things we do about reality, at least those parts that impact how we act. We have a pretty detailed story in our heads about what the universe is and how we can constructively act in it, not because of one flash-in-the-pan event, but because the workings of natural reality have been borne out to us in detail and verified through repetition. And even then, a lot of what we conclude about it is tentative by degrees, depending on how well we've gotten the chance to observe it. When we consider this, it becomes clear how much Christians are asking us to conclude based on very little information when they appeal to these hypothetical scenarios. Whether it were a being of light appearing to you and saying it was God, or a person parting an ocean in Jesus' name, what you are witnessing would present you with a small number of facts that are limited in scope and come as a jarring exception to everything about reality as you've observed it so far. Which means there would be a lot of honest questions you should have about what the event was and how you should incorporate it into your existing understanding of reality. If you were to bypass these questions by adopting a whole new understanding of reality, you'd be making up most of it in your head, or using the opportunity to connect what you just saw to an existing narrative. This means that my answer to the question, what would it take to make you believe, is not as simple as a single appearance, and certainly not as simple as apologetic lines of reasoning. Nor should it be. My belief in God would have to develop and be affirmed by degrees as he started to manifest in reality. And what I believed about him would be based solely on what I saw from him. And by the way, this isn't me digging in and being uniquely stubborn about the possibility of believing in God. Sure, Christians may get frustrated when I don't bite at scraps of hypothetical evidence they use to try compensating for God's long history of not manifesting. But this isn't how you establish the reality of anything. Just as I've previously said that a cosmological argument for my children would not get me to start living as if they existed, simply having one appear to me once and say, I exist and I'm your child, would fail to do the same. If I'd never seen a child before, it would be nothing but a confusing, disorienting experience, and it wouldn't give me good reason to start buying more groceries, setting up bedrooms, and enrolling the one-time visitors in school. So when Christians expect me to change my life based on a similarly weird, out-of-place experience, they're actually expecting me to react with unique, one-time credulity I would never apply to any other situation. Basically, what would it take to make you believe is being asked out of desperation because God is not an evident part of reality, and appeals to apologetics or one-time appearances are just shortcuts born of that desperation. That's why I don't even see the need to answer, what would it take to make you believe? And that's why it truly is a dumb thing people say to atheists. Oh, and let's also remember the questions are just hypothetical. So, Christians haven't even gained the ground they're fantasizing about, meaning they're still at square zero waiting for any evidence at all. This program was made possible by a grant from Anthony Guthrie, John Adams, Maggie Danger, S.R. Foxley, Bob Generic, The Crowd Pleaser, and Q, and by the generous support of viewers like you. If you'd like to join them in pledging to this channel, please find a link to the Prophet of Zod Patreon below. A few weeks ago, I was scrolling through Facebook when I ran into a video titled Famous Christians Deconverting, in which a Martin Iles of the Australian Christian Lobby discusses the recent trend of high-profile Christians leaving the faith. And while I usually let Christian media scroll by without comment, posts where Christians talk to other Christians about non-believers usually grab my attention. So I powered through all 24 minutes of this video and discovered that, no surprise, Iles says a lot about the motivation and mindset of these former believers, which is something he might have been better off asking them about instead. And also, no surprise, most of what he says can be mildly characterized as, less than charitable. So I thought it would be worth taking some time to deconstruct how he talks about these former Christians, and to discuss the effect his message has on the conversation between believers and non-believers. And since it's best to let people speak for themselves when possible, I reached out to one of the subjects of Martin's video, John Steingard, and asked him to offer some of his own insights. So hello, John, and thanks for joining us.
What's up, everybody? I'm John, and thank you, Prophet of Zod, my new friend, who we have met on the internet. Thank you for inviting me on to answer a few questions about some of these really important issues. I hope I can contribute something meaningful to the whole discussion, and that's what I'm going to try and do.
And I appreciate you taking the time to share your thoughts. John was part of a Christian band called Hot Nelson, and has very recently experienced doubts about his faith and a recent high-profile deconversion. So I look forward to getting feedback from him about how he and others were portrayed in this video. Were they just knowingly rejecting God? Did they decide their way was better than his way? Were they driven by pride and a desire to sin? Or were there maybe other, more sincere motivations for why they left the Christian faith? Quick hint, it's going to be the last one. But join me as we break down Martin Iles' take on famous Christians deconverting.
Okay, third topic of the day. I'm going to deal with something a little more substantial, a little more in-depth, demands a bit more attention. And it is this subject of deconversions, which seems to be the modern term for apostasy, as with a lot of modern things, that gets a little bit mellow, a little bit smoothed over.
Why is apostasy a better word than deconversion? And why is the idea something that has to be mellowed or smoothed over? Already, Martin seems to be signaling to Christians that leaving the faith is not only negative, but so negative that describing it in neutral terms is euphemistic. From the start, deliberately or not, he's setting the tone for how his viewers should perceive former Christians.
But it is the fact that I have been observing now on social media a range of very high-profile deconversions, people leaving, renouncing their Christian faith, and doing so extremely publicly. August 2019 was former Hillsong worship leader from Australia, Marty Sampson. July 2019 was acclaimed Christian author of I Kiss Dating Goodbye and other books, Joshua Harris, along with his wife, Shannon. In February 2020, the massive US social media personalities Link and Rhett, for those who know them. Others might know them through the What's in the Bible series as the Bentley Brothers. March 2018, former US-based Christian band Under Oath. May 2020, Canadian Christian singer John Steingard. And there's been others. There's some musicians, Michael and Lisa Gungor, I think that's how you say it, US Minister Bart Campolo, and others. The thing about the names that I've mentioned is not just that they're quite high profile, and especially a few of them there, like Josh Harris, but the very, very public nature of their renouncing of their faith and the commitment that they had to their faith before that time. They were all involved deeply in church stuff, they were Christian musicians, Christian authors, missionaries in the case of Link and Rhett, and so on. And in most cases, this played out so publicly on social media platforms in very great detail that I'm sure it did quite a lot of damage.
Here we have more of what I would consider unconstructive, bloated language. Now, to be fair, I can understand why it would seem like these deconversions did what a Christian would see as damage. As sure as stories of high-profile atheists becoming Christians can bolster faith, the idea of high-profile Christians leaving the faith can tap into insecurities and introduce a lot of questions. If a relationship with Christ is so real, why would a devoted follower leave? If God's existence is so obvious, how can someone go from true belief to true disbelief? And does this mean I, or someone I love, might start to experience similar doubts? But this is only damaging given the assumption that your religion is true and it's inherently good for people to remain in it. And while it's within your rights to hold to this assumption, you need to be able to step out of it, at least hypothetically, to get a broader understanding of the phenomenon and have constructive conversations with others about it. I can't say it's malicious, or even inarguably bad of Martin to start this way, but one way or the other, he's torpedoing any chance his audience will approach these deconversion stories with an open mind.
In the case of Lincoln Red, it actually played out through hours of podcast material where they talked about it. And I've read what they wrote, all these people, and I've considered it all very carefully. They're very sad stories. They're stories of doubt, which leads ultimately to outright rejection. Now, I don't have the luxury of interviewing these guys, but I can only read what they've said, read it carefully and reply. And what they've said, I think they've said very, very publicly and intentionally publicly, so I'm comfortable that public response is appropriate.
So far, this has been a very well-measured, well-structured introduction, accumulating here where he sets the terms of what he plans to do in this video. Basically, he's going to give his own personal thoughts on high-profile Christians who have left the faith. Since they did so publicly, he feels justified in addressing it publicly, which is fair. And since he doesn't have the chance to interview them, all he can do is offer his own personal insights, which might be fair too. But if they're not available, is there any point in speculating on their motivations instead of asking them? Maybe, I guess. And I can see the appeal or even utility in Christians rallying together in an attempt to process something so huge. But it's at best inherently tricky, being rife with potential for misunderstanding or even disrespect, and no matter how Martin goes about it, it's clear he's stepping out onto some pretty thin ice.
I'm going to focus on the most recent four, that is Steingard, Harris, Lincoln Rhett, I'll deal with together, and Sampson. When I did read and listen to those stories, something struck me. It struck me that each story sounded remarkably alike. There's a great deal of overlap. Same themes continually surfaced, and they wrote lots and lots about their situation. Now let me run through stuff that came through continually. First, they all said that they rejected the idea of judgment. That God, as a God of justice who judges, that was a key point of contention. That was described as harsh, unloving, judgmental, and unreasonable. Okay, so that's the first point.
This is a bit tricky for a variety of reasons. First off, we're dealing with a communication barrier, as there are a lot of questions about what's called God's judgment that sound very sensible from the outside, but for a variety of reasons land differently on the ears of many believers. But I want to focus on a more immediate problem, that of Martin's phrasing. He says that these deconverts rejected the very idea of judgment, which is a suspiciously sweeping choice of words. Because judgment will refer to a variety of things, some more positive ones including personal discretion and the dealing of judicial consequences, and we can often associate it with the idea of justice. Thus, rejecting judgment can sound problematic if you're not clear about what you mean. And to see why, it will help to skip forward to where Martin cashes in on the suggestion later in the video.
You know, we also do know that evil will be ended. You know, the atheist doesn't know that Hitler will be judged, for example. Doesn't know that the wife basher will face justice. Doesn't know that the criminal who kills their family member is somebody who will face God, who will give an answer, who will give an account, because they will. And that's a great thing. Justice is, these people, they rejected justice. They said God is judgmental, and that's horrible. No, it's not. It's the greatest thing in the world.
So, John, I'm curious. To what extent do you reject God's judgment, and what does this mean to you?
So, when sort of thinking about the Christian notion of judgment and what we see in the Bible and what we talk about in sort of Christian culture as judgment being essentially that evil finally gets dealt with by God. And I've had this question asked to me a few different ways. And one person asked me, you know, like, if there's things you don't really wish judgment on them,
Alright, so hopefully tomorrow I can get finished up most of the background on here. And then get over to that piece.